Hello and welcome to this session of BAM Live. I'm delighted to be joined by John Morgan, CEO at Object Matrix, and Shane Warden, CTO at ATP Media. Guys, welcome.
Hi Darren, thank you for inviting.
Shane, if I can come straight to you and ask you to set the scene for us with regards to the session that we're here to talk about today in terms of storage and the issues and solutions that you used.
Sure. Thank you for inviting me on, and it's a pleasure to be able to speak to you today. I guess we'd rewind a few years in some respects, but for many years ATP Media has had its own sort of commercially facing archive, which our broadcasters directly access and agencies around the world also come to, and that's our sort of shop window, if you like, and on it are effectively those sort of crown jewels that you would expect in and around our Masters Series tennis. But as you can imagine, with the number of tournaments that we have across the tour, and that now sort of hits the sort of 65 tournaments globally, there's a lot more media in the background, and the historical way that organizations like us in sport have tended to store stuff has not been as cohesive as certainly I would want to see it. And so the search was on really to create two things really in terms of a safe place to store everything, but also a place that we could then start to migrate our content away from the legacy formats, be it the tape, be it the file-based formats as well. And so the search was on really for something that was scalable and flexible enough to move with us as we started to push forward on this preservation, because ultimately, those were the assets that we didn't necessarily know whether they were going to be the crown jewels of the future, but we certainly felt from a heritage and preservation perspective across the tour that they were important enough to keep alive.
Absolutely, and I know many other content owners feel the same way. Tell us, what was the criteria for the system for you to be able to cope with the demands of your preservation project?
So I guess one of the big things, you sort of have to understand that ATP Media is a business anyway, where a lot of people are very surprised when they sort of, come through the front door of ATP Media and see that there are actually very few of us. It's only relatively recently that we've tipped over the 50 mark of people. So one of the big important things for us was that we were really keen on having a managed service for this. So we don't have scores and scores of IT guys, engineers. We don't have any on-prem kind of world. And I'd sort of moved the whole business to cloud over many, many years of, just from our own digital workplace perspective as well, and how we collaborate. And so this is very much part and parcel of that, and to have this concept of a managed service that we could effectively constantly rely on, that was resilient, scalable. It had it was globally accessible as well, and therefore needed to be cloud-based. Initially, we were looking at both options of public and effectively private, and having something that was ultimately versatile, because our plans for the future were going to include clearly, connecting and into other things potentially, and to having a system that was versatile enough to be able to interop with any other systems.
And I know from talking to you guys earlier, the final solution you selected was Matrix Store Cloud. Was there any byproduct of this move to that solution?
I think, one of the big compelling things for us was that the Matrix Store solution actually comes with vision, layered over the top of it, which is great, because it gives you that sort of that human readable, access into a storage environment, and as a sort of mini asset management system. One of the great byproducts that came with it was the capability for it to do partial file restore, which, if you can imagine, most tennis matches are between sort of 1.5 to 2 hours long each, and when we're trawling through so many different matches and thousands of matches and content, To be able to just pull out salient points without actually having to access and download an entire match at full resolution was a big win for us on that respect. And then it became quite clear that the flexibility of the system and the way it worked lend itself very, very nicely as well to what I term as production asset management. So we've talked just now about the preservation aspect of it, but here is a sort of a managed service cloud-based environment that actually opened itself up very nicely for our production teams to use in the production asset management. So that the content they were shooting and needed to upload and share with others, content that they were able to access from this year's tournaments. So not in an archive sense, in the true sense, but in that sort of production archive where people have got to pull out stuff very quickly and use it in terms of where they edit. And so, elements of that, really came to the fore, and during COVID, obviously, when suddenly everybody was scattered to the wind, and we were managing content that we were producing on site, and effectively sort of scavenging back to push into what we call the media store, which is our name for the Matrix Store system. But they were pushing from site, they were pushing from our remote location, and on both sites they were also pulling away from there as well. And at the same time, our digital and social media people around the world were also able to access and store and share what they were working on at the same time. So yeah, I mean, it was perfect timing in some respects, that the system, we were going to roll it out gently during that first year of COVID, but it literally day one went straight into full service.
Yeah, I guess that's some of us in the industry have a lot to thank the pandemic for, because it certainly expedited a lot of decision-making processes, that's for sure.
Yeah.
I think one of the hardest things to kind of get across as a vendor is flexibility. So you talked about the technical flexibility, but it's also the team flexibility. And how do you define that in a contract? You really can't, kind of write flexibility into a contract very easily. But what we've enjoyed with ATP is both that we could build up the service, we could add on the functionalities, they could gain trust as we went, hopefully. And also just regular meetings, always staying in touch, always talking to their technical team, making sure that we're doing the right things that they need. And that flexibility, I think every company talks about it, but it's so hard to define. It's so hard to promise in a way that can be delivered, but actually once that working relationship happens, you start to build that.
That's a good point, John. I think without getting into it, I think that's where procurement departments that some customers use don't quite get that part of the contract. And that's a discussion for a different time, I know, but I understand the point you're making. John, sticking with you, what were the biggest challenges involved in migrating content from multiple storage sites across multiple, storage formats?
Well, actually the same problems that you always get with migration. So with migration of video, especially very large data sets, disparate silos of data, disparate silos of metadata. Maybe the metadata for that data lived in a database, maybe it lived in the asset itself. And then of course that's exacerbated in a pure cloud environment by the size of the pipe. Now, how quickly can I move that data from A to B? And in the case of ATP, and actually in the case of most migration projects, you have your work in progress. You have your growing archive at the same time as you have your static pieces, and how do you keep everything in sync so that you can move things across? So with all of that, there's a number of ways that we can take on that challenge. Obviously, object storage is great for keeping the metadata with the data as you go forwards. So it's about joining up the metadata and the data together. But then it's also about, okay, do we have file acceleration? Do we have snowball devices in order to be able to move chunks of data across at the same time? And then ultimately, again, that regular communication with the customer to make sure that things are happening at the right pace, that the right data sets are moving across and that the work in progress is continuing.
Okay, and sticking with you, John, Shane mentioned something that he referenced as production asset management. How did you understand that and then integrate that capability into the platform for ATP Media?
And as much from a technical point of view, it's been much the same. Obviously, we need to be very aware of bandwidths and use cases. The private cloud system that we went along with enables file system access. It enables access across more asynchronous or REST interface. So we had that flexibility built into the product in order to be able to enable those workflows. So from a technical point of view, yes, again, that regular communication, making sure the tools had the functionalities in there that were particularly needed by ATP. But however, ATP Media, we very much went along with the core product there.
Okay. And also, Shane mentioned that two of the key factors for him when looking for a solution were security and scalability. So how does Matrix Store address those points?
First of all, I would say that Object Matrix has a long history of working with security. So our background is working with the banks, with medical people, even going as far as some military related projects in previous life prior to Object Matrix. And all of those require security from the inside out, first and foremost. So security starts with our product. It starts with the immutability of data in certain instances. It starts with having audit trails. And of course, the full certificated access of users that are coming in and out of the product using the media which is in there. Then secondly, in case of individual instances in the cloud, we very much believe in a policy of private networks where we have a customer, very important customers like ATP Media, where we need to make sure that that whole environment is properly firewalled and sandboxed against any kind of infringement from outside of that network. So that's very much the core of the security. In terms of the scalability, it's our product, right? It's object storage. Object storage is inherently made to be super scalable, to be able to go up to 10s, 20, hundreds exabytes of data. And that, again, is the inside out. It's what we're about. It's about making that scalability, not just in terms of how much can I store, but that actually the performance can go up, the access points can go up, and all provided from inside of the technology.
Okay, fair enough. Shane, I'm going to switch back to you. You've obviously gone through this process. What learning curves have you gone through? What advice would you give to anyone else considering the move to object storage?
I think one of the things I end up talking to a lot of people about is ultimately simplifying what we all do. I mean, we all have our secret sauce and we all do amazing things in our own ways, but fundamentally we kind of do three things. We make stuff, we move stuff, and then we store stuff. And I know it sounds like a horrible simplification of it all, but the big thing for me here is that we have, when we're building systems like this, we've got to sort of realize if we're storing stuff, how long really we're going to store it. And to reference, John was talking about how static is this stuff? Because if it's really static, then that's fine. That has a certain way that you go about, addressing its storage needs. But for a lot of us, especially in sport, our problem is moving stuff. We move stuff a lot, right? So, once we put stuff into storage, we need to potentially get it back out again, or pass it on to someone else, share it with them. And this is when a platform like the Matrix Store really comes into its own, because of those audit trails and the security that we were just referencing. it becomes a real key aspect to it from everyone's perspective. And I think then underneath you layer in ultimately in terms of a storage environment, it is object based, right? And that in itself was really, really important to me and should be hugely on the top of everybody's list when they're looking for modern day storage environments, because once you're in an object based environment, your options are almost endless effectively in a way. And that was a real driver for me, because these are systems really that, and just like in Matrix Store, I mean, particularly in Matrix Store, if I speak in that respect, we can mount that as a local volume using the MXFS storage, file system, or we can present it as an S3 bucket, or, there's pretty much any way that we can present this storage to almost anything. And that gives us freedom to this interoperability world that that is very much part of the world that I live in now, where this system can and will and does sit underneath all sorts of other aspects of our lives. And does it in a way that is very simple to deliver in terms of how we get it set up, and then how other systems can then very quickly start to use it as if it was very much part of their own system in the first place. So that capability of layering other things, whether you're talking about our world of AI and ML type based things, or simply embedding it into our world of edit and other areas, it's grown and grown and grown. We work very closely with our colleagues over at the ATP themselves, who's the federation and governing body of the players and the tour itself. But obviously they have a lot of content of their own too. And what this has done is sort of opened their eyes to actually, a shared collaborative environment where you do have your levels of privacy that you may need and you want, but huge, great opportunities to push and share content between both sides, and therefore allow flexibility on their side too when they want to start to, for instance, bolt it into various things that they might be doing in the fan engagement world, for instance, and other areas. So, it's that total sort of, I don't know, it's a sort of Swiss Army knife really in terms of storage, because you'll always open up the tool you need, and it's been highly successful for us, I have to say.
Okay, well that's a glowing endorsement, and certainly nice to hear of the advice that you gave. So thank you for that. And John, switch to you for the last question now. I guess the same question really, but not just perhaps from an AT Media perspective, but from the perspective of all your customers that you have, from lots of different parts of the industry. What advice would you give to anyone considering the move to object storage?
What advice would I give to anybody in the IT world? In a way, we see these circular things, don't we, which just happen again and again. So you get a dominant player in the industry, and then you get vendor lock-in, and you get increase in pricing that doesn't really make sense. And you get the problem of interoperability with things which are outside of their infrastructure and so forth. So, I mean, we've seen it. I could name examples, of the history of IT. We all know them. But the whole thing for me is to work with people who really have open at the core of what they do, to really avoid doing things like making metadata vendor locked in, to actually have systems that will work with different AI, ML systems without kind of hoops and costs that you just don't want. So that's certainly one advice. It's the same advice that should always be thought of. Another advice would be very much to, in the cloud world, be very wary of DevOps costs. DevOps costs can really come and bite you badly. The people are quite hard to get hold of. The expertise is quite specific. And then what is developed with those DevOps is sometimes, it becomes a project in itself. So you think you're going from, hey, I'm escaping from my on-prem IT skills requirements, and I'm going to a cloud world, and that's all going to be okay. Well, not necessarily. You may be buying yourself into a whole bunch of expensive actions that are going forward. So in that context, yes, if you can find the partner that works with you, then very much that's a good thing to do.
Well, super. Thank you so much for your time, gents. We've come to the end of the time for the session. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you, and very interesting indeed from a case study point of view. Thank you so much.